Here's Andrew. What's up?
45.
Yeah. Thank my panelists here. I think what term that I was hearing a lot was this issue of disruption, massive disruption. And I think that's the focus of looking forward here. In light of the kind of disruption we've had, the questions I'd like to pose to the panelists here are really twofold. The first is looking out in the next 5 years, looking at trends at the moment. What do you imagine centers of commercial activity will be like? What will change? What will be different? The second question, which we'll come back to after the first round, would be, so what does these forces impact, how they impact on the organizations? How are they changing? I think we've got some intimations of that from the past consultants here, past executive directors who are, I think of myself as a consultant, really as an executive director. So I think we're all sort of in consultation with the community, but how is this going to impact the nature of the organizations? So to join me here today, four really outstanding people. Andrew Trueblood to my immediate left. Andrew was formerly the director of planning the city. He was a deputy to the head of DemPed for a number of years, onto some other things at the moment. I can't keep track of them. Leona Agaritas, who has been running the Golden Triangle bid, itself engaged in many kinds of innovations over the last decade and a half now. Chris Lineberger, who probably needs no introduction, but Chris has the person who's, I think, championed for like 25 or 30 years, the whole notion of what he calls walkable urban places, but more importantly, led the role to help financial institutions realize that you got better returns on investment by investing in those kinds of places. And Tim Tompkins, who's a dear friend, ran a small little business improvement district called Times Square. One of the things, he's subsequently taken some time off to sort of figure out how to sort of build on that experience. So we have, I think today we have a good group of people. So let me start out with this first question. So looking forward, what do you imagine will be the nature of these centers of our community, and how will they have been changed? Andrew, can I start with you?
This is what I get for sitting to your immediate left.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me. I think it's interesting. First of all, I want to pause for a moment on your 5-year outlook, because I think that is, 5 years is how long it takes to do a real estate project, right? And so I think 5 years is the beginning of the curve of whatever the future is. I'm working on a project and we're sort of projecting out what change could be and how many residents could be, for example, downtown. And, it's a down payment is the next 5 years, and then the curve bends, right? Because then people see trends, proof points are made, and it's really year 10 and beyond where we'll really see a difference, which is both good and bad, because 10 years is a long time, but we also know that, 10 years can go by quickly. So I think that's really, it's interesting to think about 5 years. And to me, the simple answer is that we're just we'll be seeing places that people want to be. Like we were in a place where you had to be somewhere for your job, or mostly for your job, right? You had to come downtown DC to work. And now, as we heard, was it Joe talking about, now that the younger folks don't want, they don't have to, and they don't necessarily come unless they want to. And so it really is about the quality of the places. It's about not only the placemaking, but just the sense that you are somewhere. And I think if you look at DC during the pandemic, a lot of the neighborhoods really have thrived. A lot of the neighborhood retail has thrived. People are excited in their neighborhoods. The parks are going crazy. And so I think it's looking at those, why is it, what is it about those places, and how can that be brought to places that were traditionally commercial centers?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Rich. And I am Leona Agaritas, Executive Director of the Golden Triangle Bid. And before I answer that question, I just want to give a little bit of perspective of our neighborhood, because I think it's absolutely key to the question that you just asked. The Golden Triangle really kind of became an area destination in the 80s when the regional metro system opened its first leg. And at that point, if you all recall the 80s, it was about commutes, it was about suburbs, and it was less about cities. And we became, because of our phenomenal transit access, we became the key regional employment hub for the Washington, D.C. region. We are adjacent to the downtown bid. Jaron talked about that. His bid ends on 16th Street on the east side, and mine starts on the west side. To just kind of ground you a little bit in the relevance of this question, our neighborhood consists of 34 million square feet of office space and 36 residential units. That is the nature of that monolith. And, it was nothing for us to fill Farragut Square with 300 people at lunchtime on a Friday. It was absolutely nothing. We took it for granted. When we didn't do that, we had a bad week. Our world suddenly changed on March 13th, Friday, at 5 o'clock. I will never forget that moment. The world changed for us so phenomenally. And we are trying to come back. Like Jaron, this is one of those low moments, but it is hard. And I do agree with Andrew, it's not a 5-year proposition. It is going to take a really long time. On our best day, like Jaron, we had an occupancy of about 50% in our office buildings. That is a reality. And like Maura said earlier, the downtown's future is inextricably linked to the future of the rest of the city. And quite frankly, the future of downtowns and commercial districts is really linked to the future, to some degree or another, of the country and of what we're all going to be feeling when commercial property values just absolutely plummet. So it will be a transformation, and I think there's opportunity in transformation, and I'm actually very excited about it, but it is certainly not a 5-year project. And I think it was Mercedes, or no, it was Uva, who said at the beginning that bid directors wake up every morning and solve the problems that come to them. But quite frankly, we're solving the problems that are facing us today while we solve the problems and try to think about what we look like in a year or 2 years and try to reinvent that for the moment that we think we will be. And then what do we look like in 5 and 10 and 15-year horizons? Because quite frankly, that's what we're going to need to do. It's invigorating, but it's also, it's daunting. So to answer your question, Rich, which I did not forget, the highly commercialized districts are going to become more and more mixed use areas. Residential units will be much more important, and we learned that in the pandemic. We have 5 announced residential conversions in the Golden Triangle. Just today, we learned of a office to hotel conversion. They will be much more sustainable places, and in terms of the climate sustainability, as Mercedes was talking today, you will be happy to know that we are the only LEED certified bid community in the world. We embraced it years ago, and I'm excited because the EU actually is in the bid, and I'm just very energized by what she said. We will become more and more places of innovation, and I think that is what's going to differentiate cities and highly urbanized areas from the other emerging nodes that we're starting to see more and more in the suburbs. And of course, this is a key moment for Tyson's, right? Because this is their opportunity. It's a key moment for Reston as well. But I think what's going to differentiate cities is the innovation and the aspiration that they bring. And I think that is a really big area for us to lean in, particularly here in the nation's capital. We are an aspirational city, and I think we need to embrace that. And, quite frankly, a part of that is the importance of our public spaces. They can be cleansing. There is something about being outdoors and really having that moment and that experience that you cannot have when you're inside. And so public places play a key role. They will be much more inclusive as well, as, you know, several of the speakers said. And, you know, there's nothing less inclusive than a highly commercialized business district. So this is a positive change. So, you know, it's exciting. It's going to be very different. And I think in 10 years, the Golden Triangle and the downtown are going to be amazingly different. But I think we all need your support as placemaking professionals to kind of, you know, work together to create this. And I'm actually very grateful for my colleagues on the bid council because they acknowledge that and we work together on that. And I'm looking forward to it.
Chris.
A little context. What we're talking about here is the fourth level of governance of our society: federal, state, local, and place. We're just inventing this over the last 20 years. Takes many different forms: business improvement districts, community improvement districts, main streets, private sector. You know, Boston Properties out at Reston Town Center, they're the place manager. So there's a lot to learn, but it is where the society is going, because there continues to be, and this is the good news here, there continues to be pent-up demand for walkable urban development. It is going to take decades to meet that pent-up demand. And we'll look back at the COVID pandemic as a bump in the road. Now, that bump affected different places differently. In this region, there are over 50 walkable urban places that play a regionally significant role in the economy. Downtown's one of them. Golden Triangle's the second. Georgetown's a third. But Reston Town Center, National Landing, National Harbor. So of those 50, only about 15, 20 of them are in the center city. The others are in the urbanizing suburbs. I'll come back to that. So in Metro DC, 25% of all office, retail, and multifamily housing is in these 50 places. 25% of all the square footage is in these 50 places. They have a rent premium in pre-pandemic, a rent per square foot premium over drivable suburban, the only other option you've got, business parks, regional malls. They had a price premium of 76% on a price per square foot basis. So the market was saying, we're going to pay 76% more for a walkable urban place than a business park or a regional mall or a walk-up rental apartment. That was a significant price premium, and walkable urban places were growing 2.5 times faster than their base in 2010 during that decade, which meant that drivable suburban was losing market share. So pent-up demand is still there. That price premium now, as of the end of 2021, and this is data that, this is a thing that I've done over the years called foot traffic ahead, first at Brookings, then at George Washington University, now, and but also with Smart Growth America. And my prop tech startup, Places Platform and Smart Growth America, will be releasing this in 2 months. But some of the early headlines is that, again, 76% price premium on rents in 2019. It's now 70%. So that's still a huge price premium. And so the market is still there for what we do. But that bump in the road affected those 50 places differently. The winners have been the urbanizing suburbs. So what Rich is doing, Reston Town Center, obviously National Landing going through the roof. The ones that have done well and did not really take much of a back step are the downtown adjacent places. And that's not you, you're downtown. Downtown adjacent places pretty much held their own and came back really fast. It's the downtowns that really took the whack, and I think we all know that. And the reason for it is very simple, and everybody's talked about it. The product mix was skewed towards office. 80% of the office, or 80% of the square footage in downtown and Golden Triangle was office. And in Noma and Capitol Riverfront, those are the two models that really, as downtown adjacent places, stand out, and they're global models, by the way, both of those two. There's 2 or 3 other places like them globally, as far as what they've done over the last 20 years. But it's 40% office, 40% residential, 20% retail and hotels and other stuff. So the product mix has got to be fundamentally changed. And we know what that means for office owners. I mean, most of us guess that 40% of office is going to be converted to residential. And it means a haircut of anywhere from 50 to 70% in the pre-pandemic valuation. That's crushing. But it's, you know, deal with it. It's the way of the world. So we survived, but we've got the ones that used to drive this are the ones that need the most help right now. And particularly for the city budget, because DC city budget, the #1 source of revenue is office property taxes, and they're in the tank. So we've got super challenges citywide. The only other headline coming out of the research that I want to mention is local serving walkable urban neighborhoods also exploded during the pandemic in a positive way. That these walkable urban neighborhoods, basically any house built pre-1940 is going to be high density walkable urban, and the commercials coming back. There are places to walk to, huge investments into those housing, that housing stock. And it used to just go in the favored quarter. Favored quarter, every town has one, goes to where they're all where all the rich white folk live. And here, of course, it's to the northwest. It's going in all 4 cardinal directions. And that's a good thing. But it obviously has its challenges too. As far as the downsides of gentrification. So we've made it through. There is no structural shift back to the late 20th century. Drive until you qualify. That's not happening. The market wants walkable urban places, and it's up to everybody in this room to, in fact, give them that.
Thank you. Just a little more context for me. So I ran the Times Square Alliance. I also started something called Partnerships for Parks and learned most of what I think about urban, public spaces from the Project for Public Spaces when Fred was when I was working with Fred in the parks world. And I also was the chair of the International Downtown Association, so have a sense of how these things are played out in different ways. So I think fundamentally, and also I just want to say thank you. It's so moving to hear about the work down on the ground. And that brings me to one of my key themes, which it is in the micro that we are solving the macro problems. It is, to start off hearing about climate change, and the big picture there is, cities are competitive entities. They're competing with suburbs and non-suburban areas. And if they are appealing, then people will go to them. And cities themselves need to become more green, but they are fundamentally the key to solving the climate problem, which is talked about a lot more in Europe than here. And the way to solve that macro problem of climate change is the micro things, and some of the other macro problems, which are the profound divisions in our society, are, Steve Moore, thank you so much for that presentation about just the dining by, in the park. And also that you zoomed in on, like, you've got to set the table correctly, the details of hospitality and making people feel welcome, which is so profound. But then you're bringing people together without an explicit sell, but simply creating that micro environment that allows us to come together, makes a place appealing. And that's the work that all of you are doing, that is solving the macro problems of cities and in the world. A couple other themes. I think our work is about how intersection leads to innovation. The intersection of the government, private, and public sectors, which is a real structural issue that I want to talk about. How do you create the structures that allow for that soft power and those informal mixings, both at a dining room table, but also at a sort of civic level to solve problems? How do we nurture how do we use formal structures and mechanisms to nurture the informal strengths and opportunities and assets of our society? And I think, there is this invention of the bid that is 50 years old, invented in Canada, that has barely evolved. And as we have stepped into new categories of activity, which we heard about today, how does that structure need to evolve? We talked about it's the luck of the draw, whether you get a mayor or a governor that understands our role and has a sense of history. So what are the structural things that can sustain these points of intersection between the public, private, and the civic sectors, and what are those contractual, legal, and financial mechanisms that can catalyze the market responses? You're always talking about the market. We operate in a market. We're heading into a period where there's going to be another incredibly strain, fiscal and other strains on cities. Like the 70s and the 80s, bids and parks conservancies popped up in response to the failures of local government. We're about to head into another situation, and also we are in a situation where the left and the right are not generally working together. The only place where people are coming together is on a local level. So what are the ways in which we not only talk about those formal mechanisms that support these kinds of public-private partnerships, which are centered on place, but how is that also a model for how we better deliver government services at the local level? I have to quote Jane Jacobs, because one always needs to. She says, fractionated responsibility. She said it's like trying to eat through a pillow when you're dealing with all the different government agencies. Fragmented information, fragmented administration, fragmented responsibility, fragmented authority. Bids and conservancies and place management entities and informal placemaking networks are breaking that down. And she says, fundamentally, the interesting thing about coordination, both of information and action in cities, the crux of the matter, the principal coordination needed comes down to coordination among different services within localized places. And that's what bids and place management entities do. But there's very few formal mechanisms for it. The other way in which these formal mechanisms need to evolve is with respect to equity. Because all these miracles happen in places, whether it's at the Central Park Conservancy or Bryant Park, or the bids that we've all been hearing about, in places that have a certain level of resources. The model does not work in places where incomes and economic activity is lower. And so it needs to be evolved. And I think there's work to be done in combining a bid mechanism with things like forms of value capture, TIF, tax increment financing, land trusts, other things where you say, we know if we do these 10 things in these places, there will be economic activity. And how do we catalyze that, but also anticipate the equity issues that will come out of that, capture some of the value that's created. So it's not just the lucky property owners who get that, but that through NGOs and nonprofits, that value is captured and put back into the community to address potential displacement and other equity issues. And I'll just go to the example of, outdoor dining as just one, we heard about it. What happened? Government said, we're going to loosen our restrictions. In New York City, within 24 hours, 1,950 restaurants, within 24 hours, almost 2,000 restaurants said, we're going to do outdoor dining, self-certify that we did that. Unleashed this huge amount of activity. But as I learned when Times Square Street became a plaza, there is no legal, financial, regulatory framework for how these streets, which are, as somebody said, formerly thought about only for transit, function as public spaces. That's where the work is to be done. And thinking about the appropriate ways in which commercial activity happens in public space, all these different things. So those are some larger frameworks that will help us, by solving these micro problems, address the macro problems of our cities surviving and our planet surviving.
So let me just jump into that and a little deeper and to ask that question of, as you all look out, talk about the kind of governance structures or the kind of arrangements that we might see, organizational arrangements in the future. I mean, Andrew, you were inside government for a long period of time. You're now a chance to step outside, but I know you struggled inside the government, just trying to make people work together, much less now what Tim is inviting is a whole different way of looking at it. As you look into the future, do you see us getting there, or do you see us essentially stuck in the same rocky places that we're at the moment?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I don't see the government changing. So that's, and there's a reason for it. I actually stand up, like, people talk about government silos. There's a reason there are silos. Different agencies need to exist with different purposes, right? So I don't think, that is just a fact. It's not a judgment. And that's true whether you talk about local or federal government. Those things are all going to exist, and they will always try to work across silos and succeed at various degrees. But I agree that where it can succeed, where it has succeeded in the past, and where I think we're seeing great possibility is in really bringing that together at the local level, at the place level, at the place. And I just want to take it. You didn't ask this question, but I'm going to answer it anyway. It's fascinating to me, like, even if you look at like a lot of the federal investments right now, like they are place-based. They might be more metro and region-based, but even the federal government, I feel like in a way that hasn't happened before, is considering the importance of place. And so I just it's a really interesting moment, given I think all that has happened with COVID. So, but at this level, I agree. And when you're thinking about different levels of bids, I would encourage you all, if many of you know, or if you haven't, look into the 11th Street Bridge Park, which I think is a great example, really driven by a nonprofit organization in collaboration with the Urban Institute. Maybe there is a bid out there. This is in DC. It's 11th Street Bridge. It crosses between two parts of the Anacostia River, kind of in Navy Yard on one side and historic Anacostia on the other. Both have bids, Capitol Riverfront on one side and the Anacostia bid on the other, but are those bids are very differently funded, and in different ways. But this work that is being done at 11th Street Bridge Park is saying, given these major investments, we want this to happen. Like, we want these investments, we want this neighborhood to be better for everybody. And we know there is change. How do we put in place tools and investments and structures to make it work for existing residents and for new residents and new visitors? And I think that it's a really interesting effort there's a bid overlay, but I think it's almost bigger than it is bigger than the bid. So I think that is a really interesting model when we think about equity and we think about changing places and how you may be able to respond to that.
Yeah, just if I can, it seems to me we've been talking about a model, the bid model, which has generally been dominant for the last few years. Main Street kind of sits on the backside of this. But it's been a kind of model that the private sector raises the money and the private sector governs primarily. And then executive directors given permission to get into the soft world, if you like, the collaboration. But is there a new role that government has to play in terms of being the financing of this? And as I said, I'm out in Tyson's, and I wanted to say to them a year and a half ago, you guys are crazy trying to do this all public sector. We have an organization right now that has FOIA requirements. I don't know how to deal with FOIA. It's a very different world when you get the public money, and yet the public money is huge. So I guess I'm raising the question here about the financing model, which in some respects is also drives the ability to create these collaborative models at the local level to govern. Do we need to think about that as well? Maybe just let me take a crack at that before Leona takes it.
Yeah, I would just say, whether it's FOIA, whether it's contracting requirements, whether there's all sorts of things, the reasons why we create non-governmental organizations to do the work. And I think, how do I say this on the camera? There's democracy, right? Like there's, like elected officials and elections and voting, right? Like all of that is part of government, which is, wonderful and the bedrock of like what we all exist in, but it's also can be really challenging, right? We all know that, right? So I think the great thing that the nimbleness of these organizations is really a critical piece, and the fact that they're not that they're accountable to stakeholders. It's the accountability is pretty clear, and the accountability and the nimbleness together, I think, are important. Now, I think it raises the question. I think there's still the question of equity, and if you're in a place that doesn't have that economic vibrance. But then, how does that work? And I think, is there a role for the government to help start that up and to try and get it going? I think that might be the case. And the other thing I would say, and this was sort of to the earlier panel, like there's definitely a role for placemaking for the government to change things structurally when that happens, whether it's thinking about tax abatements, whether it's thinking about investments in government services, government places, libraries, all of those things. I think, the placemaking organizations can bring light to that. They can advocate and they can inform around that. And I think those are really critical. I mean, I think two great examples in downtown Bid are Franklin Park and the MLK Library, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars of investments that are making that place, that area, those two areas, but the downtown Bid, I think, really well placed for the future.
Well, I do agree with Andrew about the role of government and whether government's going to change. Before I came to the Bid, I worked 11 years for the district government, and then 10 years for the regional subway system in a leadership role. And government does exist for a purpose. Over a period of time, it sometimes becomes very unwieldy, which is, I think, why Chris is talking about this fourth kind of governance, because to some degree we're getting to this point where it's just too hard to lift it up and move it. And one thing about bids is that they are very nimble and very agile and resilient. And I think we all demonstrated that during the pandemic. However, there are some fundamental principles that government meets on behalf of its, of its key stakeholders, and those being the residents. I do think we've begun to move in the direction of more and more public financing with the stimulus funds. I just kind of joked about it, but it's a reality. The government had so much money in stimulus funding that they did not have the capacity to move. And I think they acknowledged it. The procurement policies, now, we're talking about why government exists and what some of the limitations are. The procurement policies made it absolutely impossible. Other procedures made it impossible. When you operate on a big scale, like a citywide scale, you have to scale your project to the lowest common denominator, whereas a bid can come forward with something very intense and very meaningful for the location where it is. But I do think that we've begun to see, the Golden Triangle was given funds to catalyze an innovation district on Pennsylvania Avenue adjacent to the White House. And I think because, DEMPED realized that we were on the ground, and if there was any chance of getting that to move, it was through a small, nimble organization. So I think we're going to see more of that in the future, because I think this has proven its value. The bids have risen to the challenge, and more, I think that has gotten us respect. And has brought us on an even ground. And Rich, you've been around a long time, and you know how hard it was at the beginning to get the government to talk to us. And there was a lot of concern about, competition for funds and this and that. But I think over the years, we have proven that, and we have especially proven that during COVID. So I think there is clearly a path ahead for that.
So a slightly different approach. I think the bids evolved in the 90s as what classically were called public-private partnerships. They were obviously a vehicle of the state that then were put in place by cities, and the public sector basically set them up, but the private sector ended up managing them on a day-to-day basis. So it was a public-private partnership. What's evolved over the last 10 years, as far as my sense of bids throughout the country, throughout the world, the most successful ones have flipped that. And they're really private-public partnerships. The private sector's in the leadership role, and the public sector's at the table, but they're not in leadership. And I think we see some of the best examples of place management as private-public partnerships. What I think we're going to see over the next 10 years, and what we're seeing already on the ground, of course, is the private sector finally gets that walkable urban development is far more profitable, far more successful. It's what the market wants. And we're going to see more and more purely private sector place management, particularly in the suburbs. So what JBG Smith is doing, what Brookfield's doing, what Boston Properties is doing out at Reston Town Center, they are the new competition. And they have a lot more resources that they can throw at this. And they don't have to ask their local city councilor if this fits their particular principle that city council person is running on. So it's going to be even more nimble. So I'm a private sector kind of guy myself. As a developer, we are doing development projects in urbanizing suburbs outside of Philadelphia. And it just moves a lot faster. And I think that's going to be a major competitor that we can learn from in places like DuPont and downtown and Golden Triangle. That it's the privatization of public spaces. And obviously there's all sorts of social equity types of issues that must be dealt with. But quite honestly, I think the private sector is going to, I think, have a pretty interesting take on social equity as well.
If I can, before Tim responds, the new board in Tyson's is 43 members, 22 are from the private sector, 21 are from the public civic sector, just one different. The executive committee is 13, 7 are from the private. I think the public-private partnerships was what kind of grew up first, and they grew up around development corporations, interesting enough, and then they went to bids. Now maybe there's a notion of coming back to some relationship, but it was public-private partnerships. Now I think this private-public partnership is an intriguing idea. Tim, I'm sorry.
A few things about the intersection of public and private sectors, and also public and private money, and also bingo on like the details and the complexity of hybrid governance structures. I mean, that what, like a one-person plurality makes a huge difference in terms of the private sector's willingness to invest. And Alex Garvin, who wrote The American City, What Works, What Doesn't, says city planning is about a series of government actions which trigger a sustained and widespread market reaction. And I'll add something he didn't have, which is like with guardrails, like for a particular purpose. It's not just the unfettered market, because we know the unfettered market and unfettered capitalism brings a lot of growth, but then there's a lot of equity issues. And so where do you put in those guardrails? But those details, I mean, with Partnerships for Parks, when we started that in New York, it was about how does this model that works for the Central Park Conservancy and Bryant Park work in these other smaller places? And one of the interesting things was the very first administrator of Central Park, Betsy Rogers, was a hybrid position. She reported both, she's the head of the Central Park Conservancy, the completely private entity, but she also is a city official responsible for managing that park. And that makes many people's heads explode, especially in government. That kind of ambiguity and complexity in governance is, I think, the key to some of these solutions, but it's really hard. The good thing about it is if you have, a democratic oriented, we believe in government point of view, then you can talk about, the public sector being at the table. But if you have, as we probably will in a couple of weeks, a government which is much more skeptical about government and much more a believer in private sector activity, then they can look at this hybrid beast and say, I like that part, and other people can say, I like that part. And that gets a little bit to what we learned in the Partnerships for Parks about equity beyond the places of resources, which is and public and private money. The fact is, and we saw this also with just like neighborhood groups that were trying to program open streets with the Department of Transportation. Like you can't, first of all, you got to eliminate the constraints, like 17 permits. Somebody said 17 permits. Like a small neighborhood organization cannot handle that. So loosen the constraints, but also there has to be direct grants of public money to these smaller entities in a way that is different from, the self-sustaining mechanisms of bids and big, parks, private entities. There just has to be government money that goes. The question is, how do you do it? And one thing I will suggest is the notion of sort of citywide entities that are basically NGOs that are re-granting organizations. An example, when the community gardens in New York were going to be destroyed, Bette Midler's organization, the Trust for Public Land, said we're going to create these trusts that work with these tiny neighborhood groups to offer them technical assistance and support and money. So that could be a model that there's some citywide entities where all the constraints of government money go away because the government money gets put into this NGO or not-for-profit, and then they're working with the neighborhood and community partners, but they're funded with government money, and yet the independence and entrepreneurial and innovative nature of those local entities is maintained and supported rather than strangled by government.
Well, thank you, my panelists. I want to make one final observation. Years ago, someone observed that good leadership and good leaders have a high tolerance for ambiguity and complexity. I mean, this is probably the most ambiguous time and will continue to be. And I think Jaron kind of expressed it, and Leona kind of expressed it. You're in that space, but that's the space in the middle. And wherever we're moving forward, that's going to be a quality that we just have to accept. But it's actually I think it's the stream we go fishing in. And anyway, I want to thank my panelists here. I thank all of you and turn it back to Uwe.
Please join me in thanking all of our partners, our speakers, and please thank you for even coming. It's been just an amazing morning. There's so much to continue speaking about, exploring. Please be in touch with us. And we look forward to carrying this conversation, this dialogue, and the knowledge frameworks associated with this practice further. Thanks so much. That's it. Thank you.